Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Police. Minister, I refer to the government's proposed firearm reforms, which have not been introduced into Parliament, have not been provided to the opposition nor a briefing offered, and yet the detail of which appear to have been provided to the state's media, including the announcement of a buyback scheme, which we are left to presume is detailed in the looming legislation. And I ask, how is it that your government has yet again prioritised a splash in the West Australian of a bipartisan consultation on reforms, and two, noting reports concerning WA Police deleting submissions without reading them, how confident are you that every piece of feedback provided to them was appropriately considered?
The Minister for Police.
Thank you, Speaker. Member, a little confusing the nature of your question. Firstly, what was announced today was the detail around a buyback scheme, which was actually reported in November or December last year. Was actually included, the amount that would be afforded to or appended to the buyback scheme was in the mid-year financial review. It was a publicly available document. It was reported in the media, albeit it didn't get much coverage. The splash you're referring to with the West was on page 7, I think. A small report on page 7 on the left-hand side. Essentially what we did today, and then I was asked at I was doing media with respect to some gambling, illegal gambling dens that had been busted last year. I was doing that today, and media asked me about the buyback scheme, which we were responding to questions about today. All that happened today was some detail was provided around what would be available for firearms owners in terms of buyback, depending upon the age and the nature of their firearm would dictate what amount they would get. It's pretty much the proportions available is commensurate with the Howard era buyback. So that's the nature, how old the firearm was, and if it was up to that age, it would be worth a proportion, or you'd be offered a proportion of the original value, and then if it was over age 6 years, it would be offered a lesser proportion. And so that's commensurate with what was offered in the Howard era. They're pretty generous. It doesn't pay for what an individual purchased the firearm for, but it offers a buyback. And the most important element to remember is this is completely voluntary. No one has to do this, but people should know. And you talked about somehow we've surprised people with the content of the intended or impending content of the legislation. There was a consultation paper last year which was open for people with all manner of detail as to what was being considered in the legislation. You're right, you haven't been given a briefing because we haven't introduced it to Parliament. The legislation will be introduced and then you'll get a briefing.
Supplementary?
Supplementary question.
Could the Minister please outline then how he arrived at the figure of $64 million as the appropriate amount of money for the buyback?
The Minister
Speaker,
for Police.
So the amount of the buyback was determined through assessing all of the intended reforms, which are all focused on providing legislation, a new licensing regime that would address unlawful firearm activities and make explicit that possessing and using a firearm is not a right but a privilege. That privilege being conditional on the paramount need to ensure public safety within the state. That's what drove a range of measures which were proposed in the consultation paper and will be in the bill. And all of those measures, through applying those measures and assuming a number of implications or consequences of those measures, you can predict the range of up to the maximum number of firearms that might be removed from the community in the event that all of those measures are enacted, and firearm licence holders who currently hold firearms licence either surrender or have their firearms taken from them. So there is a number where they won't be eligible for having a firearm anymore. But there may be a lot of firearms owners currently under the lax legislation that you failed to improve that will not be able to have a firearm in the new regime and may want to take advantage of the buyback. That's how they determine it. So it's hard to predict because it's voluntary. They don't have to sell their firearm to us, to the government. They might sell it somewhere else. But it will be between 90 and 100,000 if all of the potential predicted numbers are returned via the buyback.